The drill bit snapped in half, and Damien Vale froze at the sound, because in his world, sudden noises were never an accident. He was alone in his father's old study, standing over a wall of built-in oak cabinets that had not been touched in 20 years. He had come to renovate the room, nothing more. He wanted to erase the dust and the silence that had settled into every corner since his father's funeral 3 months earlier. He did not expect the wall to hide anything until the drill bit caught on something solid behind the plaster, something that should not have been there. He set down the broken tool and pressed his palm flat against the panel. It gave, just slightly, like a door that had been waiting years to be opened. He worked his fingers into the seam and pulled. Wood groaned, dust fell in a soft cloud, and a narrow drawer slid free from a space that had no business existing in a wall that was supposed to be solid. Damien's heart beat faster than it had in a long time. He had walked into rooms full of armed men without flinching. He had negotiated with rivals who wanted him dead. But this small, dark drawer made his hands unsteady in a way nothing else had. Inside, wrapped in a square of yellowed cloth, was a single photograph. He lifted it into the light. A young woman looked back at him, her eyes bright, her smile careful, as though she had been told to hide something even as the picture was taken. She wore a plain blue dress and stood in front of a fountain he did not recognize. She was beautiful in a quiet, unassuming way, nothing like the polished women who usually appeared in his father's world. He turned the photograph over. On the back, in his father's unmistakable handwriting, were a name and a date. Marguerite Hale, the 14th of June. Damien stared at the words until they blurred. He had never heard the name Marguerite Hale in his life. Not from his father, not from any of the men who had served the family for decades, not from the endless files and records he had inherited, along with the empire that came with his father's death. A name should not simply vanish from a man's life, unless someone worked very hard to make it disappear. Beneath the photograph, folded twice, was a letter. The paper had yellowed at the edges, but the ink was still dark, still legible. Damien unfolded it slowly, aware that his hands were shaking now, an unfamiliar feeling for a man who prided himself on control. The letter began without a greeting, as if his father had written it only to himself. I have hidden this because a man who hides nothing has already lost. If you find this, it means I am gone, and it means the truth has outlived my silence. Marguerite deserved better than what I gave her. She deserved better than what our world allows any of us to give. I made a choice that protected the family, and it cost her everything. If she is still alive, she will not want to be found. But you will need to know who she was to understand who you are. The letter ended there, unsigned, as though his father had run out of courage before he could finish it. Damien read it 3 times before he set it down on the desk beside the drawer. His mind, usually so precise, so capable of calculating risk and consequence in an instant, could not settle on a single thought. His father, Antonio Vale, had built one of the most feared and respected criminal empires in the country. He was a man who spoke in absolutes, who taught Damien from childhood that sentiment was a weakness no one in their position could afford. And yet here was proof, hidden inside a wall for who knew how many years, that Antonio Vale had loved someone enough to hide her existence rather than risk losing her to the life he led. Or worse, rather than risk her losing her life because of what he was. Damien sat down slowly in the leather chair that had once belonged to his father. The study smelled of old wood and older secrets. Outside, he could hear the muted sounds of the estate going about its business. Guards changing posts, a car pulling into the long gravel drive, the ordinary rhythm of a life built on power. None of it touched him in that moment. All he could think about was the woman in the photograph and the date written beside her name. He needed to know if she was still alive. He needed to know why his father had never spoken her name, not once, in 30 years. Damien was not a man who acted on impulse. Every decision he made was calculated, weighed against risk, examined from every possible angle before he moved. It was how he had survived long enough to inherit his father's position without a single rival daring to challenge him outright. But something about the photograph pulled at him in a way that bypassed all his careful instincts. He found himself standing, walking to the window, looking out over the grounds without truly seeing them. He thought of his men first, the small circle of soldiers and advisors who had served his father and now served him. He trusted them with his life in the way that mattered most in his world, the way that meant they would take a bullet meant for him without hesitation. But this was not something he could hand over to soldiers. A secret his father had buried inside a wall was not the kind of thing you asked other men to dig up for you. If Marguerite Hale was still alive, and if she had spent decades hidden from the Vale family for her own protection, then sending armed men to find her would be the surest way to destroy whatever peace she had built for herself. He needed to move quietly, alone. Damien spent the rest of that day locked in the study, going through every drawer, every hidden panel he could find, searching for anything else his father might have left behind. He found nothing more, only the photograph and the letter, as if Antonio Vale had wanted his son to have just enough information to start searching, and no more. It felt deliberate. His father had never done anything without purpose, not even in death. That night, Damien could not sleep. He lay in the dark of his bedroom, the photograph resting on the nightstand beside him, and turned the pieces over and over in his mind. Marguerite Hale, the 14th of June. A woman his father had loved enough to protect, and apparently enough to give up. He thought about his mother, who had died when he was young, a woman he barely remembered, beyond the scent of her perfume and the sound of her voice reading to him at night. His father had never remarried, never spoken of love again in all the years Damien had known him. Damien had always assumed that was because his father had never recovered from losing his wife. Now he wondered if there was more to that silence than grief. By morning, Damien had made a decision. He would find out who Marguerite Hale had been, and if there was any chance she was still alive, he would find her. Not as the head of the Vale family, not with the weight of his position pressing down on every interaction, but as a man trying to understand a truth his father had spent a lifetime hiding. He began where any careful man would begin, with the smallest thread he had. The photograph had been taken in front of a fountain, and Damien recognized architectural details in the background that placed it somewhere in the old quarter of the city, a part of town that had changed dramatically over the decades but still retained pieces of its original character. It was not much, but it was a start. He also had the date, the 14th of June, written beside her name. It could have been her birthday. It could have marked something else entirely, an anniversary. A day of significance only his father would have understood. Without more information, Damien could only guess. He decided to approach the search the way he approached everything else in his life, methodically and without emotion, even though emotion was exactly what was driving him. He would need records. Old newspapers, property documents, anything that might contain the name Marguerite Hale from 3 or 4 decades earlier. He could not use the family's usual channels for this kind of research, not without drawing attention from men who might ask questions he was not ready to answer. Instead, he reached out to a private researcher he had used once before for a delicate matter, a woman named Helena Bright, who specialized in finding information other people wanted buried. Helena arrived at the estate 2 days later, brought in through a side entrance, and given no explanation beyond the barest details Damien was willing to share. He showed her the photograph, the name, the date, and told her only that he needed to know everything she could find about a woman named Marguerite Hale who might have lived in the city several decades ago. Helena studied the photograph for a long moment before looking up at him. "There is something in the way you're holding this, Mr. Vale, that tells me this is not a business matter," she said. "It is not," Damien admitted. "It is personal." "Then I will treat it that way," Helena said, and left without asking further questions, which was exactly why Damien had chosen her. The days that followed felt strange to Damien in a way he could not fully explain. He continued running the business his father had built, meeting with his lieutenants, reviewing the endless stream of decisions that came with controlling territory and managing rival relationships. But underneath all of it, a single thought kept surfacing. Somewhere out there, a woman his father had loved and hidden might still be alive, and she had no idea that the man who once protected her at great cost had died without ever explaining why he had let her go. Enzo Marchetti, one of Damien's most trusted men, noticed the change first. Enzo had served the Vale family since before Damien was born, and he had a way of reading Damien's moods that even Damien himself sometimes missed. During a routine meeting about territory disputes on the east side of the city, Enzo watched Damien's attention drift for the third time in an hour and finally spoke up. "You are somewhere else today," Enzo said, his voice low enough that the other men in the room would not hear. "That is not like you." "I am fine," Damien said, though the words came out flatter than he intended. Enzo did not push further, but Damien saw the concern settle behind his old friend's eyes, and he knew that concern would not simply disappear. Enzo had a talent for noticing things that others missed, and Damien understood, even then, that keeping this search hidden would not be as simple as he hoped. A week after Helena Bright began her search, she returned to the estate with a folder of documents and a look on her face that told Damien she had found something significant. She spread the papers across the desk in the study, the same desk where Damien had discovered the drawer, and began walking him through what she had uncovered. Marguerite Hale had indeed lived in the old quarter of the city, decades earlier, working as a seamstress in a small shop near the fountain shown in the photograph. Public records showed she had left the city rather suddenly. Around the same time, the Vale family had been consolidating power in a series of territorial conflicts that Damien knew about only from stories his father had told him as warnings, not celebrations. "There is a gap here," Helena said, pointing to a section of her notes. "She disappears from every public record for almost a year. No address, no employment, nothing. Then she resurfaces under a different name in a town several hours from here." Damien leaned forward, studying the documents. A different name. Why would she change her name unless she was hiding, or being hidden? "Do you have that name?" he asked. Helena nodded and slid a single page across the desk. Damien read the name written there, and something in his chest tightened, because it was not the name that mattered most in that moment. It was the small note beneath it, a record of a birth registered under that new identity, dated almost exactly 9 months after the date written on the back of the photograph. A child. Damien sat back slowly, the implications settling over him like a weight he had not been prepared to carry. If Marguerite Hale had a child around that time, and if that child had been born after she vanished from the city and reinvented herself under a new name, then there was a real possibility that somewhere out there he had family he had never known existed. Not just a woman his father had once loved and lost, but a connection that ran deeper than a photograph hidden inside a wall. He looked up at Helena. "I need to know where she is now," he said. "And I need to know if that child is still alive." Helena studied him for a moment, the same careful assessment she had given him days earlier, and then nodded. "I will find out," she said. "But Mr. Vale, if this leads where I think it might, you should be prepared for what you find. Sometimes the truth people hide is hidden for good reason." Damien did not answer right away. He looked instead at the photograph still resting on the desk, at the careful, guarded smile of a woman who had once meant enough to a powerful man that he sacrificed his own happiness to keep her safe. Whatever the truth was, whatever his father had been protecting her from, Damien knew he could not simply close the drawer and pretend he had never found it. He had spent his entire life believing he understood exactly who his father was and exactly what kind of man he himself had become because of it. Now, for the first time, he understood that there were parts of his father's life kept locked away, not out of weakness, but out of a love so complete it demanded silence. "Find her," Damien said quietly. "Whatever it costs, find her." Helena gathered her papers and left without another word, and Damien remained alone in the study, long after the sun had set, the photograph still in his hand, the letter still open on the desk, and a question forming in his mind that he was not yet ready to answer. If he found this woman, if he found the child who might share his blood, what would he do with the truth once he had it? And more than that, what would it cost the people connected to it? People who had built quiet, hidden lives specifically to stay out of reach of everything Damien Vale represented. Damien thought about calling off the search more than once in the days that followed. Every instinct that had kept him alive in a dangerous world told him that some doors were better left closed, that his father had hidden this truth for a reason, and that unearthing it might bring danger to people who had done nothing to deserve it. But every time he tried to convince himself to stop, he thought of the unfinished letter, the sentence his father had never completed, and he understood that Antonio Vale had wanted this truth to surface eventually. A man who wished for a secret to die with him would have burned the photograph, not hidden it behind a wall where it could one day be found. There was also something else pulling at him, something harder to name. For as long as he could remember, Damien had built his life around control, around making sure nothing was left to chance. He had inherited an empire built on careful calculation, and he had never once allowed himself to wonder what it might feel like to want something simply because his heart told him to. His father's letter suggested that even a man as disciplined as Antonio Vale had once let go of that control, had once loved someone enough to risk everything for her safety. Damien did not yet understand why that mattered so much to him, only that it did. He met with Helena Bright again 3 days later, this time in a quiet cafe far from the estate, away from the eyes and ears that surrounded his usual world. She brought with her a thin folder, thinner than he expected, and slid it across the table without ceremony. "I found where the trail leads," she said, "but I want to be clear with you before you look at this. Once you know, there is no way to unknow it." Damien opened the folder. Inside was a single page with an address, a name, and a short note describing a woman who worked as an art restorer in a modest neighborhood on the other side of the city, far removed from anything connected to the Vale family or the world Damien had grown up in. The name on the page was not Marguerite Hale. It was a name that belonged, according to Helena's research, to a woman born 9 months after the date on the back of the photograph. "This is her," Damien said quietly. It was not a question. Helena nodded. "If the records are accurate, this young woman may be the daughter of Marguerite Hale. I could not confirm whether Marguerite is still alive. That trail runs cold about a year after the birth. But her daughter is very much alive, and from what I can tell, she has no idea about any connection to your family." Damien sat with that information for a long moment, staring at the address written on the page, the quiet weight of it settling over him. Somewhere across the city, a woman was living an ordinary life, unaware that a hidden drawer in an old study had just pulled her into the orbit of a world she had never chosen and might not survive discovering. He thanked Helena, folded the page carefully, and placed it in his jacket pocket beside the photograph he now carried with him everywhere. He did not yet know what he would say to this woman, or how he would explain his interest without frightening her away or putting her in danger. He only knew that he could not simply walk away now that he had a name and an address. That night, standing once again at the window of his father's study, Damien looked out over the grounds of the estate and made a promise to himself that felt different from every other decision he had made since taking control of the family. He would find her, and he would do it carefully, quietly, without the machinery of his world crushing whatever fragile piece she had built for herself. Whatever the truth turned out to be, he owed her that much, even before he understood exactly why. Somewhere across the city, in a small studio filled with the smell of paint and varnish, a young woman named Elena Rossi carefully restored the cracked surface of an old painting, entirely unaware that a man from a world she had never known was about to walk into her life and change everything she believed about who she was. The bell above the studio door rang, and Elena Rossi looked up expecting a courier or a neighbor, not the tall, composed stranger who stepped inside and immediately seemed to fill the small space with an intensity she could not explain. "Good afternoon," he said, His voice calm, controlled, the kind of voice that made people listen without needing to raise itself. I was told this studio handles restoration work for older paintings. I have a piece that needs careful attention. Elena wiped her hands on the cloth tucked into her apron and studied him for a moment. He wore a dark coat that fit too well to be anything but expensive, and there was something in the way he held himself, still and watchful, that reminded her faintly of the security guards who sometimes escorted wealthy clients into galleries across the city. But his eyes, when they met hers, held none of that professional detachment. They studied her with an intensity that felt almost personal, as though he were searching her face for something specific. "We do handle restoration," she said carefully. "May I ask your name?" "Damien," he said, offering nothing more. Elena nodded slowly, filing away the slight hesitation before he spoke, the way he seemed to choose his words with unusual care for someone discussing something as simple as a painting. "Well, Damien, why don't you tell me about the piece you need restored?" He described a portrait, an old family piece damaged by years of neglect, and though the details were vague, Elena had handled enough client inquiries over the years to sense when someone was testing the waters rather than genuinely seeking her services. Still, business was business, and she agreed to meet with him again once he brought photographs of the actual painting so she could assess the extent of the damage. What she did not know, and what Damien was careful not to reveal, was that there was no portrait, no family piece in need of restoration. The visit had been an excuse, a way to see her in person, to study the woman his father's hidden letter had led him to find. Standing across from her in the studio, surrounded by half-finished canvases and the sharp scent of turpentine, Damien found himself struck by something he had not expected. Elena Rossi carried herself with quiet confidence, her hands steady, her manner direct without being unkind. There was a resemblance to the woman in the photograph, not identical, but present in the shape of her eyes and the careful way she smiled, as though guarding something even in a simple greeting. Over the following days, Damien returned to the studio twice more, each time with a new detail about the fictional portrait. Each visit, an excuse to spend a little more time in Elena's presence. He told himself he was gathering information, confirming the connection, before he risked revealing anything about the photograph or the letter. But somewhere between the second and third visit, the reasons blurred, and Damien found himself looking forward to the sound of the bell above her door, in a way that had nothing to do with the search that had brought him there in the first place. Elena, for her part, found herself curious about the quiet, careful man who kept returning with vague answers about a painting that never quite materialized. She noticed things about him that did not add up. The way his eyes moved across a room as though cataloging every exit, the way he seemed to weigh every question before answering, as though even casual conversation carried risk. She was not foolish enough to ignore those signs entirely, but there was also something in the way he looked at her, something careful and searching, that made her curious rather than afraid. "You still haven't shown me a single photograph of this painting," she said during his third visit, setting down her brush and crossing her arms with a small, knowing smile. "I'm beginning to think you don't actually have one." Damien hesitated, caught between the careful plan he had constructed and the unexpected pull he felt toward honesty in her presence. "You're right," he admitted. "There is no painting." Elena's smile faded slightly, replaced by a more guarded expression. "Then why are you here?" Damien considered his answer carefully. He was not ready to show her the photograph. Not yet. Not until he understood more about her own history and whether she knew anything about her mother's past. Revealing too much too soon could frighten her away entirely, or worse, put her in danger before he understood what kind of danger existed. "I am trying to understand something about my family's history," he said finally, choosing his words with precision. "Something led me to this neighborhood and to your studio specifically. I did not expect to find the conversation as interesting as the search. It was not the full truth, but it was not a lie either, and Elena seemed to sense the honesty underneath the careful phrasing. She studied him for a long moment, weighing whether to press further or let the strange admission stand on its own. That's either the most honest thing a stranger has ever said to me or the strangest excuse for wasting my time, she said. Damien allowed himself a rare, small smile. Perhaps it's both. Their conversation shifted after that, becoming less guarded, less about the fictional painting and more about the ordinary details that build familiarity between two people. Elena told him about her work restoring damaged art, the patience it required, the quiet satisfaction of bringing something ruined back to its original beauty. Damien listened more than he spoke, aware of how rarely he allowed himself simply to listen to another person without calculating the angles of the conversation. He learned that Elena had been raised by a woman she called her mother, though something in the way she spoke about her childhood suggested complications Damien recognized immediately. Elena mentioned, almost in passing, that her mother had passed away several years earlier after a long illness, and that she had grown up without much knowledge of her extended family, her mother having always been private about her past. She never talked much about where she came from, Elena said one afternoon, mixing pigments at her workbench, while Damien watched from a nearby stool. I used to ask when I was younger, and she would always change the subject. I stopped asking eventually. Some people carry their history quietly, I suppose. Damien's chest tightened at those words, the confirmation settling over him with a weight he had not fully prepared for. If Elena's mother had died without ever revealing her past, then the truth Damien carried in his jacket pocket, folded carefully beside the photograph, might be the only key to understanding where Elena had truly come from. He did not tell her that day. He told himself he needed more time, more certainty, though he suspected the real reason was simpler and harder to admit. He did not want to risk the fragile connection building between them, the easy conversations, the way Elena's guarded expression softened slightly each time he visited. He was not used to wanting something for himself rather than for the sake of the family's position, and the unfamiliarity of that feeling made him hesitant in a way nothing in his usual world ever had. Back at the estate, however, Damien's absences had not gone unnoticed. Enzo Marchetti, sharp and watchful as always, began asking quiet questions among the men who managed Damien's schedule, questions about where his boss disappeared to during the hours he claimed to be handling personal matters. Enzo had served the Vale family long enough to know that personal matters, in their world, rarely stayed personal for long, and he had a nagging sense that whatever Damien was hiding could put the family at risk if it was not handled carefully. He is not himself, Enzo said one evening to Lucia Ferraro, another longtime member of the family's inner circle, a woman whose loyalty to the Vale name ran as deep as Enzo's own. He disappears for hours, comes back distracted, and will not say where he has been. Perhaps he simply needs privacy, Lucia offered, though her tone suggested she shared Enzo's concern more than she wanted to admit. He just lost his father. Grief makes people behave strangely. Enzo shook his head slowly. This is not grief. I know grief. This is something else. And in our world, Lucia, secrets have a way of becoming dangerous, whether they start out that way or not. Lucia did not argue further, but she agreed quietly to keep her own eyes open, to watch for anything unusual in Damien's movements or decisions. Neither of them suspected the truth, not yet, but their instincts, sharpened by decades inside a world built on careful vigilance, told them something significant was unfolding beneath the surface of Damien's carefully controlled life. Meanwhile, Damien continued his careful courtship of the truth, returning to the studio again and again under increasingly thin excuses, until even Elena stopped pretending she believed there was ever a painting to restore. Their conversations grew longer, drifting from careful, guarded exchanges into something warmer, something that surprised them both with how easily it seemed to develop, despite the secrets sitting quietly between them. One evening, as the studio emptied of the last afternoon light and Elena cleaned her brushes at the end of the day, she turned to Damien with a directness that caught him off guard. "I don't know what you're really looking for," she said, "or why you keep coming back here. But I find myself wanting you to keep coming back anyway, even without an explanation. That probably makes me foolish." Damien rose from his stool and crossed the small distance between them, something in her honesty pulling loose a caution he had carried since the moment he first found the photograph. "It does not make you foolish," he said quietly. "It means you trust your instincts, even when the full picture is not yet clear. I promise you, Elena, when the time is right, I will explain everything. There are things I am still trying to understand myself." Elena studied his face, searching for deception and finding none, only a careful, guarded sincerity that matched the strange, quiet pull she had felt toward him since his first visit. "Whatever this is," she said softly, "I hope it is worth the wait." Damien did not answer immediately, his mind caught between the growing certainty that Elena Rossi was connected to his family by blood neither of them yet understood, and the equally powerful, unexpected feeling that had nothing to do with bloodlines or old letters at all. As he left the studio that evening, the photograph still folded in his jacket pocket, Damien understood that time was no longer entirely his to control. Somewhere behind him, in the world he had left at the estate, Enzo Marchetti's suspicions were growing sharper with each passing day, and somewhere across the city, in circles Damien had not yet considered, the name Vale still carried enemies who would see any weakness, any unexplained absence, as an opportunity worth exploring. Enzo did not wait long before acting on his instincts. 2 days after his conversation with Lucia, he followed Damien himself, keeping a careful distance as Damien's car wound through unfamiliar streets far from the estate and the usual territory of the Vale family's business. Enzo watched from across the street as Damien entered a small studio tucked between a bakery and a shuttered bookshop, an ordinary building with nothing about it that suggested any connection to the family's affairs. Enzo did not go inside. He had learned patience over decades of loyal service, and he understood that confronting Damien directly would only push his boss further into silence. Instead, he made note of the address, the hours Damien spent inside, and the calm, unhurried way he left the building each time, none of it matching the urgency Enzo would have expected from actual business dealings. Whatever was happening inside that studio, it was personal, and personal matters, in Enzo's long experience, were the ones most likely to catch a man off guard when he least expected it. He returned to the estate that evening, troubled in a way he could not fully articulate, even to himself. He trusted Damien, had trusted him since the boy was young enough to sit on Enzo's knee and ask questions about the world his father ruled. But trust and vigilance were not opposites in Enzo's mind. A man could love someone and still recognize when that person was walking toward danger without seeing it clearly himself. He decided for the moment to say nothing to Damien directly. Instead, he began quietly gathering information of his own, asking careful questions through contacts who owed him favors, trying to learn who owned the small studio and who worked there. He told himself he was protecting the family, protecting Damien from whatever complication had drawn him away from his responsibilities so many times in recent weeks. But beneath that justification sat something closer to fear, a growing certainty that whatever Damien had found, it carried the potential to unravel far more than either of them yet understood. Meanwhile, Damien remained unaware that his movements had drawn attention, focused instead on the delicate balance he was trying to maintain between uncovering the truth about Elena's mother and protecting the fragile trust growing between himself and Elena. He returned to the photograph often during quiet moments at the estate, studying the young woman's careful smile, comparing it in his mind to the openness he had begun to see in Elena's expression when she forgot, even briefly, to guard herself around him. He also returned to his father's unfinished letter, reading it again and again as though searching for meaning he might have missed the first several times. She deserved better than what our world allows any of us to give. The words settled differently in his mind now that he had met Elena, now that he understood, even partially, what his father might have been protecting her from. A life inside the Vale family came with wealth, power, and protection, but it also came with constant danger, with enemies who would use any vulnerability as a weapon, with a world where love itself could become a liability if the wrong people learned of its existence. Damien began to understand, slowly and uncomfortably, that his father's decision to hide Marguerite Hale and whatever child she carried might not have been born from weakness or cruelty, but from a desperate, painful kind of love, the sort that chose distance over danger, silence over the risk of loss. It was a realization that complicated everything Damien thought he understood about his father, a man he had always believed incapable of that particular kind of sacrifice. He carried that new understanding with him during his next visit to the studio, arriving later than usual, after Elena had already begun closing up for the evening. She looked up when the bell rang, a flicker of relief crossing her expression before she could hide it, and Damien felt something shift further inside his chest at the sight of it. "You're later than usual," she said, setting aside the cloth she had been using to clean her workbench. "I had things to think about," he admitted, settling into his now familiar seat near the window. Elena studied him for a moment, then crossed the room and sat across from him instead of returning to her cleaning. "Care to share any of it? Or is that still part of the mystery you're not ready to explain?" Damien considered the question carefully, weighing how much he could reveal without unraveling everything before he had confirmed the full truth. "I had a complicated relationship with my father," he said finally, choosing honesty even without full disclosure. "He died a few months ago, and since then, I have been learning things about him I never expected, things that make me question how well I actually knew him." Elena's expression softened, the guarded curiosity replaced by something gentler. "I'm sorry," she said. "Losing a parent changes how you see everything, even the parts of your life that have nothing to do with them. You understand that better than most people," Damien said quietly. Elena nodded slowly. "My mother's death did something similar to me, made me question things I thought I understood about my own life. I still don't have all the answers. I'm not sure I ever will." Damien looked at her for a long moment, the photograph and letter sitting heavy in his jacket pocket, the truth he still had not shared pressing against the growing warmth between them like a stone he could not yet set down. He wanted, more than he expected, to give her those answers, to end the uncertainty that had shaped so much of her life without her ever understanding why. But he also understood that once he spoke the truth aloud, there would be no returning to the careful, uncomplicated conversations they had shared over these past weeks. Everything would change, for both of them, and he was not yet certain either of them was ready for what that change might bring. "Soon," he said softly, more to himself than to her. "I will tell you everything soon." Elena did not press him further, though the curiosity in her eyes remained. Instead, she reached across the small distance between them and rested her hand briefly over his, a small, simple gesture that carried more weight than either of them fully acknowledged in that moment. "Whatever it is," she said, "I hope you find the peace you're looking for." Damien left the studio that night with the strange, unfamiliar sense that he was standing at the edge of two futures, one where he continued protecting the fragile truth a little longer, and one where he finally allowed it to surface, no matter the consequences. Behind him, unseen in the growing darkness of the city streets, Enzo's quiet investigation continued to gather momentum, drawing closer each day to uncovering the very secret Damien was trying so carefully to protect. The photograph in his pocket had once felt like the beginning of a private search for the truth about his father. Now it felt like the opening move in something far larger, something that would not stay hidden much longer, no matter how carefully Damien tried to protect it. The folder hit the desk with a sharp slap, and Enzo Marchetti's expression left no room for pleasantries. "You need to see this," Enzo said, his voice tight with a tension Damien rarely heard from his old friend. Damien looked up from the paperwork spread across his desk, immediately recognizing the shift in Enzo's demeanor. In all the years Enzo had served the family, Damien had rarely seen him this unsettled. Whatever was inside that folder, it was not routine business. "What is this?" Damien asked, though something cold had already settled in his stomach. "I followed you," Enzo said plainly, choosing honesty over pretense. "Weeks ago, I saw you going to a studio across the city, and I saw you going back, again and again. I did not say anything because I trusted you had your reasons. But I could not stop myself from looking into who owns that place and who works there. Damien's jaw tightened. You had no right. I had every right, Enzo shot back, his voice rising slightly before he caught himself and lowered it again. I have protected this family for 30 years. When the head of that family starts disappearing for hours at a time and comes back distracted, unfocused, careless in ways I have never seen from you, that becomes my business whether you like it or not. Damien said nothing, the weight of Enzo's words landing harder than he wanted to admit. He gestured for Enzo to continue, bracing himself for whatever conclusion his old friend had reached. Enzo opened the folder and spread several documents across the desk, property records, employment history, and a photograph of Elena taken from a distance outside the studio. Her name is Elena Rossi, Enzo said. She works as an art restorer. On the surface, nothing about her seems connected to our world at all, but I kept digging, because something about your behavior told me there was more to this than a simple romantic interest, and I found something strange in her mother's history. A name change, decades ago, right around the time your father was fighting to secure his position against rival families. Damien's hands went still on the desk. I don't know what you're hiding, Damien, Enzo continued, his voice dropping into something closer to concern than accusation. But if this woman is connected to something from your father's past, and if the wrong people learn about that connection before you understand what it means, this could put both her and this family in serious danger. You need to tell me what is going on. Damien sat in silence for a long moment, the careful control he had maintained since discovering the drawer finally beginning to crack under the weight of Enzo's investigation. He had wanted more time, more certainty, before anyone else became involved, but that time had apparently run out without his permission. He reached into his desk drawer and retrieved the photograph and the letter, sliding them across to Enzo without a word. Enzo read the letter slowly, his expression shifting from confusion to something closer to shock as the pieces began falling into place. Your father hid this, Enzo said quietly, more statement than question. For decades, Damien confirmed. I found it by accident, tearing out an old cabinet in his study. I have been trying to understand what it means ever since, and trying to determine whether Elena Rossi has any connection to the woman in this photograph. And, does she? Enzo asked. I believe she is Marguerite Hale's daughter, Damien said, which would make her connected to our family by blood, in a way my father clearly wanted kept secret, for reasons I still do not fully understand. Enzo sat back, processing the weight of what Damien had just revealed. This changes everything, he said finally. If word of this reaches the wrong ears, especially anyone connected to families your father had conflicts with decades ago, that connection alone could make her a target. Old grudges in our world do not simply disappear with time, Damien. You know this. I know, Damien said quietly. That is exactly why I have been trying to handle this carefully, quietly, without drawing attention. Enzo studied him for a long moment, something softening in his expression despite the seriousness of the conversation. You care for her, he said. This is not only about your father's secret anymore. Damien did not answer immediately, but the silence itself was answer enough. Enzo nodded slowly, understanding settling over his features. Then we protect her, Enzo said firmly. Whatever this connection means, whatever your father was hiding, we do not let old enemies use it against either of you. But Damien, you cannot keep operating alone on this. If there is danger coming, you need people who can help you see it before it arrives. The conversation shifted after that, the tension between them easing slightly as Enzo committed himself to helping rather than simply investigating from the shadows. Together, they began piecing together the full history behind the photograph, searching through old family records for any mention of conflicts involving the Castellano family, longtime rivals of the Vale organization whose territory had once bordered the old quarter where Marguerite Hale had lived decades earlier. What they found troubled Damien deeply. Records suggested that decades earlier, Antonio Vale had made a deal with the Castellano family to end a violent territorial conflict, a deal that had required him to sever all connections to anyone the Castellanos might consider a vulnerability, including, it seemed, a woman he loved and the child she may have been carrying. The peace between the two families had held for decades since, fragile but unbroken, built on secrets neither side had ever fully disclosed. If the Castellanos learn that woman exists and that she is connected to you by blood, Enzo said grimly, they may see it as a violation of the old agreement, whether that was ever your father's intention or not. Men like Victor Castellano do not need much of an excuse to reopen old wounds if it benefits them. Damien absorbed this information with growing unease, understanding now the full weight of what his father had been protecting when he hid the photograph away, rather than destroying it entirely. Antonio Vale had chosen silence not out of shame, but out of necessity, sacrificing his own happiness to preserve a fragile peace that had protected countless lives in the decades since. But Damien was not his father, and he was no longer willing to accept that same sacrifice without question. I need to tell Elena the truth, he said finally. She deserves to know who she is, and she deserves to understand the danger that might come with that knowledge. I cannot continue hiding this from her while trying to protect her from something she does not even know exists. Enzo nodded slowly. Then let us make sure she is protected before you tell her anything. If word gets out before we have controlled how and when it spreads, we lose any advantage we might have in keeping her safe. Over the following days, Enzo quietly arranged additional security around the studio and the modest apartment where Elena lived, careful to keep his men discreet enough that Elena would not notice anything unusual. Damien, meanwhile, wrestled with how to finally share the truth he had been carrying since the day he first opened the hidden drawer in his father's study. He visited the studio on a quiet afternoon when the streets outside were unusually still, the kind of stillness that Damien's instincts, sharpened by years in a dangerous world, recognized as the calm before something significant. Elena greeted him with her usual warmth, though she paused when she saw the seriousness in his expression. Something is different today, she said, setting aside her work. There is something I need to tell you, Damien said, his voice steady despite the weight of what he was about to reveal. It is the reason I first came to this studio, and it is something I should have told you much sooner. Elena's expression grew cautious, though she did not step away. Tell me, she said simply. Damien reached into his jacket and withdrew the photograph, setting it carefully on the workbench between them. Elena looked down at the image, her breath catching as recognition flickered across her face, faint but unmistakable. I found this hidden in my father's study, Damien said, alongside a letter explaining that this woman, Marguerite Hale, was someone he loved and was forced to hide, decades ago, to protect a fragile peace between our families and a rival organization. I believe she may have been your mother, Elena, and I believe that would make you connected to my family in a way neither of us understood until now. Elena stared at the photograph, her hands trembling slightly as she lifted it closer, studying the careful, guarded smile of the young woman in the faded image. This looks like her, she whispered. This looks exactly like an old photograph I found once, years ago, hidden among my mother's things. I always wondered who took it, or why she kept it hidden away instead of displaying it like other family pictures. Damien watched the realization settle over her, the careful composure she usually carried beginning to waver under the weight of what he had just revealed. I know this is a great deal to absorb all at once, he said gently, and I know I should have told you sooner. I was trying to understand it fully myself before bringing you into something that might put you in danger. Danger, Elena repeated, her eyes lifting sharply to meet his. What kind of danger? Damien hesitated only briefly before answering, understanding that honesty, however difficult, was the only path forward now that the truth had finally surfaced. There are people in my world, he said carefully, who might see your existence, your connection to my family, as a threat to an old agreement my father made decades ago. I do not yet know how serious that danger is, but I intend to make certain you are protected regardless." Elena set the photograph down slowly, her mind clearly racing through the implications of everything Damien had just told her. "So this whole time," she said quietly, "the fictional painting, the visits, all of it was about this." "It started that way," Damien admitted, "but it did not stay that way for long. Somewhere between our first conversation and this one, what I felt for you stopped being about my father's secret and became something entirely my own." Elena studied him for a long moment, searching his expression for any hint of deception, and finding, as she had before, only careful sincerity. "I don't know what to do with any of this," she admitted. "My whole understanding of who I am, where I come from, all of it might be built on a foundation I never even knew existed." "We will figure it out together," Damien said, stepping closer. "Whatever this means for both of us, whatever danger it might bring, I am not walking away from you now that I know the truth." Elena did not answer immediately, the weight of the revelation still settling heavily over her. But she did not step away either, and in the quiet stillness of the studio, surrounded by half-finished paintings and the fading light of early evening, something unspoken passed between them, an understanding that whatever came next, they would face it together rather than apart. That night, after Damien left the studio, Elena sat alone in her small apartment above a quiet bakery, the photograph he had left with her resting on the table in front of her, alongside a copy of the letter he had carefully transcribed so she could study it in private. She thought of her mother, of the countless evenings she had watched her sew quietly by lamplight, humming songs Elena never learned the names of, always careful never to speak of the years before Elena was born. There had been moments, scattered across Elena's childhood, when she had caught her mother staring at nothing, a distant sadness settling briefly over her features, before she noticed Elena watching, and quickly smoothed her expression into something lighter. Elena had always assumed it was simple loneliness, the quiet grief of a woman raising a child without a partner. Now, holding the photograph of a younger version of her mother standing before a fountain Elena did not recognize, she understood that the sadness had likely run much deeper than she ever imagined. She thought about the man who had written that unfinished letter, a man capable of great power and apparently great love, who had chosen to let her mother disappear rather than risk what their connection might cost her. Elena did not know whether to feel grief for the life her mother might have had, or gratitude that whatever decision had been made, it had ultimately kept her safe long enough to raise a daughter far from a dangerous world she had never fully understood until tonight. She did not sleep much that night, her mind circling endlessly through questions she had no way of answering. Had her mother loved Antonio Vale as deeply as his letter suggested? Had she ever considered returning, ever regretted the life she built instead under a different name, in a different town, far from everything she had once known? Elena would likely never have answers to those questions, her mother having taken them to her grave without ever revealing the truth, but she found a strange comfort in finally understanding the shape of the silence she had grown up around. Damien, meanwhile, returned to the estate troubled by a different set of concerns. He met again with Enzo late that evening, informing him that Elena now knew the truth, and discussing how best to protect her going forward now that the secret could no longer be contained entirely within the walls of the estate. "She took it better than I expected," Damien said, settling into a chair across from his old friend. "But I worry that the moment word spreads beyond the two of us, everything becomes far more dangerous. Word has a way of spreading in our world whether we intend it or not," Enzo said grimly. "I have kept our security around her discreet, but discreet only protects her for so long if someone with real resources decides to look closely enough." Damien nodded, understanding the truth in Enzo's warning, even as he wished circumstances were different. "What do you suggest?" he asked. Enzo considered the question carefully before answering. "I suggest you move quickly to understand exactly how the Castellano family might react if this reaches them, before they learn of it through their own channels rather than yours. If there is a way to address this on your terms, control the narrative before it controls you, that gives Elena the best chance at real safety." Damien agreed, though the prospect of approaching Victor Castellano directly, even indirectly through careful channels, filled him with unease. The peace between their families had held for decades, built on old wounds neither side had ever fully healed. Reopening that history, even carefully, carried risks Damien could not fully predict. Over the following days, Damien split his time between reassuring Elena, who remained understandably shaken by the revelation, and working quietly with Enzo to gather intelligence on how much the Castellano family might already know. Lucia Ferraro proved unexpectedly valuable during this period, her connections within rival circles allowing her to quietly gauge whether any unusual interest had surfaced regarding Old Vale family history. "Something is stirring," Lucia reported during a tense meeting in Damien's study, the same room where the entire search had begun. "I do not have specifics yet, but there is a shift in how certain people are speaking, careful references to old debts and old promises that suggest someone has noticed increased activity connected to your name." Damien absorbed this warning with growing concern, understanding that whatever window of control he might have hoped for was likely closing faster than he wanted to admit. He returned to the studio that evening, determined to speak plainly with Elena about the seriousness of the situation, no longer willing to soften the truth in an attempt to protect her from worry. "We may not have as much time as I hoped," he told her, sitting across from her in the quiet studio after the last of the evening light had faded. "There are signs that word of your connection to my family may already be spreading through circles I cannot fully control." Elena's expression tightened, though she did not panic, meeting his warning with the same steady composure she had shown since first learning the truth. "Then tell me what I need to do," she said simply. "I did not choose any of this, Damien, but I am not going to pretend the danger away either. If there are precautions I need to take, tell me plainly, and I will listen." Damien felt something loosen slightly in his chest at her steady response, grateful for a strength in her that matched his own careful control. Together, they began discussing precautions, changes to her routine, additional security around the studio and her apartment, all while Damien continued working behind the scenes to understand exactly how serious the coming danger might become. Neither of them yet knew that the car idling at the end of the street outside her apartment that very night belonged to a man already reporting details of her existence back to Victor Castellano, setting into motion a chain of events that would soon force both families to confront a truth buried for decades, whether either side was fully prepared for it or not. The phone rang at 3 in the morning, and Damien knew before he answered that whatever news it carried would not be good. "They know," Enzo said without preamble, his voice tight with urgency. "Victor Castellano knows about Elena. My contact confirmed it an hour ago. He has known for days, watching, gathering information before making any move." Damien sat up immediately, sleep vanishing under a sharp surge of adrenaline. "What kind of move?" he asked. "I don't know yet," Enzo admitted. "But Damien, a man like Victor does not sit on information like this without intending to use it eventually. You need to assume Elena is no longer just at risk. She may already be a target." Damien was dressed and in his car within minutes, calling ahead to the security detail Enzo had quietly stationed near Elena's apartment, instructing them to move her immediately to the estate, where he could ensure her protection directly. The drive across the city felt endless. Every red light, every slow intersection stretching Damien's patience to its limit, as his mind raced through every possible scenario Victor Castellano might be planning. He arrived at Elena's apartment to find his men already there, Elena standing in the doorway in a coat thrown hastily over her nightclothes, confusion and fear mixing across her expression as she took in the sudden urgency surrounding her. "Damien, what is happening?" she asked as he approached. "We need to move you somewhere safer. Right now," he said, his voice steady despite the tension coiled through his entire body. "I will explain everything on the way, but we cannot stay here." Elena did not argue, trusting the seriousness in his tone even without full understanding, and within minutes she was in Damien's car, flanked by two of his most trusted men as they made their way toward the estate. Damien explained as much as he understood during the drive, watching Elena's expression shift from fear to a hardened, determined focus that reminded him again of the strength he had recognized in her from their very first conversation. "So this Victor Castellano," she said once Damien finished explaining. "He sees me as some kind of threat simply because of who my mother might have been." "Not a threat exactly," Damien said carefully. "More like leverage. An opportunity to weaken my position, or force concessions from my family by using you as a bargaining piece. In our world, connections like yours to mine become currency for men who think that way." Elena absorbed this in silence for a long moment before speaking again, her voice steady despite the fear Damien could still see flickering behind her eyes. "And what happens now?" "Now," Damien said, "we make sure he understands that using you as leverage will cost him far more than whatever advantage he thinks he might gain." They arrived at the estate as the first gray light of dawn began creeping over the horizon, and Damien immediately called together his full inner circle, Enzo, Lucia, and several other trusted lieutenants, to begin formulating a response to the threat now bearing down on them. The study that had started this entire journey became once again the center of a critical decision, though now the stakes involved far more than uncovering old family secrets. "We have two paths," Enzo said, laying out the situation plainly for the group. "We can move defensively, protect Elena quietly, and hope Victor decides the risk of open conflict outweighs whatever advantage he thinks he can gain. Or we move first, make our position clear before he has the chance to act, forcing him to reconsider before this becomes something neither side can walk back from." Damien considered both options carefully, weighing the risks against everything he had learned since finding the hidden drawer in his father's study. His father had chosen silence and sacrifice decades earlier, giving up the woman he loved to preserve peace between the families. Damien understood now, more clearly than ever, that he was not willing to repeat that same sacrifice. "We move first," Damien said finally, his voice carrying the same calm authority his father had once commanded in that very room. "But we do it carefully. I want a meeting arranged with Victor Castellano directly. Not through intermediaries, not through careful messages passed along the usual channels. I want to speak with him myself, and I want him to understand exactly what will happen if he moves against Elena in any way." Lucia raised a cautious objection. "That is dangerous, Damien. Meeting him directly puts you at risk, and it puts Elena at greater risk if things go poorly." "I understand the danger," Damien said, "but hiding from this will only give Victor more time to plan whatever move he intends to make. I would rather face this directly, on terms I can control, than wait for him to strike when we least expect it." After considerable discussion, the group reluctantly agreed to Damien's plan, with Enzo insisting on careful security measures surrounding any meeting, and Lucia working to arrange the details through channels that would ensure both sides honored the neutral terms of the conversation. Meanwhile, Elena remained at the estate, growing more restless with each passing hour as she watched Damien and his people prepare for a confrontation she felt powerless to influence. "I don't want to simply hide here while all of this happens around me," Elena told Damien during a quiet moment between preparations, her frustration evident despite her attempt to remain composed. "This is my life too, Damien. I want to understand what is happening, and I want some say in how it unfolds." Damien understood her frustration, recognizing in her the same resistance to helplessness that had shaped his own decisions since discovering the truth about his father. "I promise you will not be left in the dark," he said. "But right now, the safest thing you can do is remain here, protected, while we handle the immediate danger. Once this meeting with Victor is behind us, we will figure out the rest together." Elena reluctantly accepted this, though the tension between wanting agency over her own life and understanding the practical necessity of caution remained visible in her expression throughout the following hours. She spent much of that time in the study, studying her mother's photograph, alongside the unfinished letter Damien's father had written decades earlier, searching for any additional clues about the woman whose choices had shaped Elena's entire existence without her ever knowing it. The meeting with Victor Castellano was arranged for the following evening, at a neutral location, chosen carefully by both sides to minimize risk. Damien arrived flanked by Enzo and a small, carefully selected security detail, his expression carrying the same calm control his father had once been famous for, even as tension coiled tightly beneath the surface. Victor Castellano was an older man, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, carrying himself with the kind of quiet confidence that came from decades of surviving in a dangerous world. He greeted Damien with a thin, calculating smile as they settled across from each other at a small table set up for the occasion. "Your father and I had an understanding," Victor said without preamble, once formalities had been exchanged. An understanding built on certain sacrifices, certain silences that kept both our families safe for decades. I find it curious, Damien, that a piece of that old history has suddenly resurfaced under your watch. "I did not go looking for conflict," Damien said evenly. "I found a truth my father left behind, a woman he loved, and a daughter neither of us knew existed until recently. That truth is not a threat to the peace between our families. It only becomes a threat if you choose to treat it as one." Victor studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "And what exactly do you propose I do with this information, now that I have it?" "Nothing," Damien said simply. "I propose you do nothing at all. Elena Rossi has no interest in your world, no claim on anything connected to the old conflicts between our families. She is simply a woman who deserves to live her life without becoming a piece in a game she never chose to play." Victor's expression shifted slightly, something calculating flickering behind his eyes. "And if I decide her existence represents an opportunity rather than a mere complication," he said. "What then?" Damien leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping into something harder, more dangerous than the careful diplomacy he had maintained throughout the conversation so far. "Then you will find that whatever advantage you think you might gain will cost you far more than you are prepared to pay. I did not come here to threaten you, Victor. I came here to give you the chance to walk away from this peacefully, the same way my father once did. But make no mistake, I am not my father. I will not simply give up what matters to me to preserve a peace built on someone else's suffering." The tension in the room stretched taut as Victor considered Damien's words, weighing the calculated risk of continued conflict against the fragile stability that had held between their families for decades. Finally, after a long, heavy silence, Victor leaned back in his chair, a thin, unreadable smile crossing his features once more. "Your father was a careful man," Victor said, "careful enough to avoid unnecessary conflict, even when it cost him personally. I will consider your words, Damien. But understand this, I did not survive as long as I have by ignoring opportunities when they present themselves. If circumstances change, so might my patience." The meeting ended without resolution, both men returning to their respective worlds with the fragile peace between their families hanging in uncertain balance. Damien returned to the estate troubled, understanding that Victor's ambiguous response left the door open to further danger rather than closing it entirely. That danger arrived sooner than anyone anticipated. 2 nights later, as Elena walked briefly through the estate gardens under close guard, a black vehicle attempted to force its way through the outer gate, its occupants intent on reaching her before Damien's security could react. The attempt failed, thwarted by the careful precautions Enzo had put in place. But the message was unmistakable. Victor Castellano had made his decision, and the fragile peace both families had maintained for decades now teetered on the edge of complete collapse. Damien stood in the aftermath of the failed attempt, watching as his security team secured the perimeter and confirmed Elena's safety, a cold, focused resolve settling over him, unlike anything he had felt since first opening the hidden drawer in his father's study. Whatever peace his father had built through sacrifice and silence, Damien understood now that protecting Elena, and finally claiming the truth his family had buried for decades, would require a confrontation far more decisive than careful diplomacy alone could provide. Elena had been brought inside the moment the alarm sounded, and when Damien found her in the main hall, her hands trembling despite her attempt to appear composed, Something in him hardened into absolute certainty. He crossed the room and took her hands gently in his own, steadying them, steadying himself in the process. "I am not going to let anything happen to you," he said, his voice quiet but unwavering. "Whatever it takes." Elena searched his face, the fear in her expression slowly giving way to something firmer, more resolute. "I believe you," she said. "But Damien, I do not want to be someone you simply protect from the sidelines while all of this unfolds around me. If Victor Castellano believes I am some kind of weapon to use against you, then I want to understand exactly what we are facing, and I want to help however I can." Damien hesitated, torn between his instinct to shield her entirely from the danger and his growing respect for her refusal to be treated as merely a piece to be moved and protected. Enzo, watching the exchange from a short distance away, stepped forward with a suggestion that surprised them both. "There may be a way to use this to our advantage," Enzo said. "Victor moved against us tonight because he believes we are vulnerable, reacting defensively to a threat we did not choose. But if we make our position public, quietly but deliberately, among the other families who observe these old rivalries, it becomes far more difficult for him to justify further aggression without appearing to break the very peace he claims to be protecting." Damien considered this carefully. "You mean force him to answer to the others, not just to us?" "Precisely," Enzo said. "Victor thrives on operating quietly, using leverage and information most people never see. If we bring this into the open, on our terms, before he can control the narrative himself, we take away the very advantage he was counting on." Lucia, who had remained largely silent throughout the tense exchange, spoke up with a note of caution. "That is a considerable risk," she said. "Making this public means every family with old ties to either side will have an opinion, and not all of them will side with us simply because the truth favors your family's honor." "Perhaps not all of them," Damien said. "But enough of them value stability over old grudges to make Victor think twice before escalating further. My father built this peace at great personal cost. I intend to make sure the rest of our world understands that cost, and understands that I will not allow it to be exploited by a man looking for an excuse to reopen old wounds." Over the following 2 days, Damien, Enzo, and Lucia worked carefully to spread word of the situation through trusted channels among the other families who had long observed the delicate balance between the Vale and Castellano organizations. They shared enough of the truth to make their position clear, framing Elena not as a vulnerability to be exploited, but as an innocent woman connected to a decades-old sacrifice that had preserved peace for the benefit of everyone involved, a peace Victor now threatened to break for the sake of personal advantage. The response was cautious but largely favorable. Several influential families made clear, through careful and indirect communication, that they had no appetite for renewed conflict over old history that had already cost enough pain the first time around. Word reached Damien that even within Victor's own organization, some of his closest advisors questioned the wisdom of provoking a fight that offered uncertain gains and considerable risk. Elena, watching this careful political maneuvering unfold around her, found herself both unsettled and strangely reassured by the complexity of the world Damien navigated so fluidly. "It is strange," she admitted to him one evening, as the tension of the previous days began, cautiously, to ease. "A week ago I knew nothing about any of this. Now I am somehow at the center of a conflict between powerful families I never knew existed." "You did not ask for any of this," Damien said gently, sitting beside her in the quiet of the estate's garden, the same grounds where the attempted attack had occurred only days earlier. "None of this is your fault, Elena. It is the weight of choices made decades before either of us were born, choices my father made trying to protect people he loved." Elena was quiet for a long moment, watching the last light of evening fade over the carefully tended grounds. "Do you think she was happy?" she asked softly. "My mother. Do you think the life she built, away from all of this, gave her something worth the sacrifice?" Damien considered the question carefully before answering. "I think," he said, "that your mother raised a daughter who is strong, thoughtful, and unwilling to be treated as anything less than an equal in decisions that affect her own life. If that is any measure of the life she built, then I believe there was real happiness in it, even if it came with its own quiet grief." Elena reached for his hand, and for a long moment they sat together in silence, the fragile peace of the evening settling gently around them despite the uncertainty still hanging over everything else. But that peace would not last. Word soon reached Damien that Victor Castellano, faced with mounting pressure from his own allies and the wider network of families now watching the situation closely, had made a final, desperate decision rather than accept the loss of advantage the public exposure had cost him. He intended to strike directly, and soon, before the shifting tide of opinion could fully close off his opportunity. Enzo delivered the warning personally, arriving at the estate late that night with a grim expression that told Damien everything before a single word was spoken. "He is not backing down," Enzo said. "If anything, the pressure from the other families has made him more reckless, not less. My sources tell me he is planning something decisive, something meant to happen quickly, before anyone can intervene." Damien felt the familiar cold focus settle over him, the same clarity that had guided him through every dangerous decision since taking control of the family. "Then we do not wait for him to choose the moment," he said. "We prepare for whatever comes, and we make certain that when it arrives, we are the ones who decide how it ends." Lucia moved quickly to strengthen the estate's defenses, coordinating with Enzo to ensure every entrance, every vulnerable point along the property's perimeter was covered by trusted men who would not hesitate if trouble arrived. Damien, meanwhile, remained close to Elena, unwilling to let her out of his sight now that the danger had shifted from distant possibility to imminent threat. "I won't pretend I'm not afraid," Elena admitted quietly, as they stood together near the tall windows of the study, watching the grounds below where Damien's men moved with quiet, practiced efficiency. "But I would rather face this beside you than hide somewhere pretending it isn't happening." Damien turned to her, something steady and certain passing between them in the charged silence of the room. "Whatever happens next," he said, "we face it together. I promise you that." Outside, the night grew still, the kind of heavy, waiting stillness that settles over a place just before violence arrives, and everyone within the walls of the estate understood, without needing to say it aloud, that the reckoning building between the Vale and Castellano families could no longer be delayed. The first gunshot shattered the quiet of the estate before dawn, and Damien was on his feet before he was even fully awake, every instinct honed by a lifetime in a dangerous world snapping instantly into focus. "They're here." Enzo's voice crackled through the radio on the nightstand, tense and urgent. "Multiple vehicles at the east perimeter. This is it, Damien." Damien moved quickly to the room where Elena had been staying, finding her already awake, alarm clear in her eyes as the distant sound of chaos reached even the quiet upper floors of the estate. "Stay close to me," he said, his voice calm despite the urgency coursing through him. "We are not letting anything happen to you tonight." They moved together through the halls of the estate, Damien's security detail forming a tight, protective perimeter around them as reports continued streaming in from the perimeter. Victor Castellano's men had breached the outer gate, overwhelming the initial line of defense through sheer numbers and the element of surprise, though Enzo's careful preparation in the preceding days meant the estate's inner defenses held firm, buying precious time. "This was never simply about testing our resolve," Enzo said grimly, meeting Damien in the central hall as they coordinated the defense. "Victor came prepared for a real fight. He intends to take Elena tonight, whatever the cost." Damien's expression hardened with a cold resolve that reminded Enzo, not for the first time, of Antonio Vale in his most dangerous moments. "Then we make sure that cost is one he cannot afford to pay," Damien said. The following hour unfolded in tense, coordinated chaos, Damien's men holding the inner perimeter of the estate, while Enzo directed reinforcements from trusted allies among the very families who had expressed discomfort with Victor's aggression in the preceding days. Word of the attack spread quickly through the careful network Damien and Enzo had cultivated, and within the hour, additional support began arriving, tipping the balance of the confrontation firmly against Victor's forces. Elena remained close to Damien throughout, refusing his repeated suggestions that she retreat to a more secure location, deeper within the estate. "I am not hiding while you fight for both of us," she said firmly. The same steady resolve she had carried since first learning the truth about her mother, now hardened into something unshakable. "If Victor wants me, he will have to face both of us together." Damien did not argue further, understanding that Elena's courage matched his own, and that whatever came next, she deserved to face it as an equal rather than a fragile secret to be hidden away. Together, they moved toward the study, the same room where this entire journey had begun, now serving as a defensible position while Enzo's men worked to secure the grounds. Victor Castellano himself arrived at the estate as the chaos began to settle in Damien's favor, his earlier confidence noticeably shaken by the unexpected strength of the resistance and the arrival of allied reinforcements he had not anticipated. He entered through the same hall Damien and Elena occupied, flanked by a handful of remaining men, his expression a mixture of fury and grudging recognition that his plan had failed to unfold as intended. "This ends now," Victor said, his voice carrying none of the calculated calm from their earlier meeting. "You have made a public spectacle of what should have remained private, Damien. You have turned old families against me, embarrassed me before people who once respected my judgment. I will not simply walk away from this without something to show for it." Damien stepped slightly in front of Elena, his own expression carrying the same unshakable resolve that had guided him through every decision since finding the hidden drawer weeks earlier. "You came here tonight prepared to take an innocent woman as leverage against a peace your own family once helped build," Damien said. "Whatever embarrassment you feel is the direct result of your own choices, Victor, not mine." Victor's jaw tightened, his hand drifting toward the weapon at his side, though Enzo and several of Damien's men moved quickly to close the distance, making clear that any further aggression would be met immediately and decisively. The tension in the room stretched taut, every person present understanding that the next few moments would determine whether this confrontation ended in further violence or in the kind of resolution that might finally close the door on decades of buried conflict. It was Elena, unexpectedly, who broke the silence, stepping forward despite Damien's instinctive attempt to keep her shielded behind him. "You did not come here for me," she said, her voice steady despite the danger surrounding her. "You came here because you saw an opportunity to weaken a rival family, using a woman you have never even met as an excuse. My mother spent her entire life hiding from exactly this kind of thinking, sacrificing everything so that I could grow up far from a world where people are treated as pieces on a board rather than human beings. I refused to become the very thing she gave up her life to protect me from." Victor stared at her, something shifting behind his calculating eyes, though whether it was respect or simple recalculation of the risks before him, Damien could not immediately tell. The room remained tense, every person present aware that violence still hung as a real possibility despite Elena's unexpected words. "Enough," Damien said finally, his voice carrying an authority that echoed his father's most commanding moments. "Victor, look around you. Your men are outnumbered. The families who once might have supported unchecked aggression have already made clear where their loyalties lie in this matter. You have lost tonight. Whether you accept that now or force this confrontation toward further bloodshed that will accomplish nothing beyond deepening a conflict neither of our families can afford to sustain." Victor's gaze moved slowly around the room, taking in the reality of his diminished position, the reinforcements that had arrived to support Damien, the unmistakable resolve in the expressions of everyone present. Slowly, visibly reluctant, he lowered his hand from the weapon at his side. the fury in his expression giving way to something closer to bitter acceptance. "This is not over," Victor said, though the words carried less weight now than his earlier threats had. "Perhaps not," Damien replied evenly. "But it ends here, tonight, one way or another. You can walk away now, accept that this pursuit has cost you far more than any advantage it might have gained. Or you can continue forward and lose considerably more than pride. The choice is yours, but know that I will not hesitate to defend what matters to me, exactly as my father once did, though I intend to do it without the same silence and sacrifice that cost him everything he truly wanted." The standoff held for several more tense moments before Victor, weighing the reality of his failed plan against the mounting cost of continued conflict, finally gave a sharp nod and turned to leave, his remaining men following him out into the fading darkness of early morning. The estate settled slowly into an uneasy quiet as Enzo's men secured the grounds fully, confirming that the immediate threat had passed. In the aftermath, as the first true light of dawn began spreading across the estate, Damien finally allowed himself a moment to simply breathe, the accumulated tension of the preceding weeks beginning to ease from his shoulders for the first time since he had first pulled that hidden drawer free from the wall of his father's study. Elena stood beside him, equally exhausted, but carrying a quiet strength that Damien recognized now as an inheritance every bit as significant as the empire he had received from his own father. "We did it," she said softly, disbelief and relief mingling in her voice. "We did it together," Damien corrected gently, taking her hand in his. In the weeks that followed, the fragile peace between the Vale and Castellano families settled into something new, no longer built on old silences and buried secrets, but on a clearer, more openly acknowledged understanding among the wider network of families who had watched the conflict unfold. Victor Castellano, chastened by the public failure of his plan and the loss of support among his own allies, retreated into a more cautious posture, unwilling to risk further confrontation that would only diminish his standing further. Damien took the opportunity to do something his father had never found the courage to do. He publicly acknowledged Elena not as a secret hidden away for the family's protection, but as someone connected to the Vale legacy by blood, and now, increasingly, by choice. He held a quiet gathering at the estate, inviting the leaders of allied families to formally meet Elena, presenting her not with apology or explanation, but with simple, direct honesty about who she was and what she meant to him. "This is Elena Rossi," Damien said during that gathering, standing beside her in the same study where the entire journey had begun. "She is the daughter of a woman my father loved and was forced to hide away, decades ago, in the name of a peace built on sacrifice rather than truth. I choose a different path. I choose truth, and I choose to protect what matters to me openly, not through hidden drawers and unfinished letters." The response among the gathered families was cautious, but ultimately respectful, the openness of Damien's acknowledgement carrying its own kind of strength that resonated even among people accustomed to careful secrecy and calculated silence. Over time, the initial uncertainty settled into quiet acceptance, the old wounds between the Vale and Castellano families beginning, slowly, to heal under the weight of a new understanding, built on honesty rather than buried history. Elena, for her part, found herself navigating an entirely new life in the months that followed, balancing her continued work restoring paintings with the gradual, careful process of understanding what it meant to be connected to a family as powerful and complicated as the Vales. She did not abandon the quiet, independent life her mother had built for her, but she also did not shy away from the new relationships and responsibilities that came with Damien's world, choosing instead to build something that honored both the past her mother had protected her from and the future she now chose for herself. One evening, months after the confrontation that had nearly cost them everything, Damien and Elena stood together in the same study where the hidden drawer had first revealed its secret. The photograph of Marguerite Hale now displayed openly on the desk, rather than hidden away in darkness. Damien had finally finished the letter his father had left unfinished, adding his own words beneath Antonio Vale's unfinished sentence. a quiet acknowledgement of the truth his father had been too afraid to fully claim during his lifetime. "Do you think he would be proud of this?" Elena asked softly, studying the photograph alongside the letter now completed across 2 generations. Damien considered the question carefully before answering. "I think," he said, "my father spent his entire life believing that love and power could not coexist safely in our world, that protecting the people he loved meant hiding them away entirely. I choose to believe something different. I choose to believe that real strength comes not from hiding what matters most, but from protecting it openly, without apology." Elena smiled, reaching for his hand as the last light of evening spilled softly through the study windows, illuminating the same desk where a broken drill bit had first revealed a truth buried for decades. Enzo found them there a short while later, pausing in the doorway before entering, a small, knowing smile crossing his weathered features. "I remember your father sitting at that same desk," he said, addressing Damien but glancing toward Elena as well. "He carried a weight in those final years that none of us fully understood. I believe, watching the two of you now, that he would have wanted exactly this, even if he never found the courage to reach for it himself." Damien nodded slowly, gratitude and quiet grief mixing together in his expression. "Thank you, Enzo," he said, "for everything. For trusting me even when my judgment seemed clouded, and for standing beside us when it mattered most." Enzo waved off the thanks with the easy familiarity of decades of loyal service. "You are family," he said simply. "Protecting family is not a debt to be repaid. It is simply what we do." Lucia joined them soon after, carrying news that the last of the tension with the Castellano family had settled into a wary but stable peace, with Victor formally withdrawing any further claims or grievances related to Elena's existence, choosing instead to focus his attention on rebuilding the standing he had lost among the wider network of allied families. It seemed, for now at least, that the danger which had shadowed Elena since the moment Damien first found the hidden photograph had finally passed. In the months that followed, Elena gradually built a new rhythm to her life, one that honored both the quiet independence her mother had fought so hard to give her and the complicated, powerful world she now found herself connected to through Damien. She continued her restoration work, though she began taking on occasional projects for pieces connected to the Vale family's own history, finding a strange, meaningful symmetry in using her careful skills to preserve pieces of a legacy she now understood herself to be part of. She also began, slowly and carefully, learning more about her mother's early life, piecing together fragments from old records, from conversations with Damien, and eventually, from a box of personal letters Marguerite Hale had apparently kept hidden away in the small town where she eventually settled, letters Helena Bright helped locate during a final, quieter phase of her investigation. Reading her mother's own words for the first time, written decades earlier in a hand Elena recognized from childhood birthday cards, gave her a deeper understanding of the woman who had raised her, a woman who had carried both loss and quiet gratitude for the safety she had ultimately found. She loved him very much, Elena told Damien one evening, several of her mother's letters spread carefully across the same desk in the study. But she also wrote about being grateful, in her own way, for the life she built afterward. She said something in one of these letters that I keep returning to. She wrote that safety without love is merely survival, but love without safety is simply another kind of loss. I think she found a way to hold both, eventually, even if it took her years to get there. Damien listened quietly, understanding now more fully than ever the depth of sacrifice both his father and Marguerite Hale had carried throughout their separate lives. A sacrifice neither of them had ever fully escaped, but one that had, in its own complicated way, led to this moment, to Elena standing in this study with her mother's letters spread before her, finally understanding the full shape of the silence that had defined so much of her childhood. "I am grateful for it too," Damien said quietly. "Whatever pain it caused both of them, it led here. It led to you." Elena reached for his hand, the warmth between them carrying the same quiet certainty that had grown steadily since the very first conversation in her small studio weeks earlier. back when neither of them had understood the full weight of the connection drawing them together. As the estate settled into a new, more open era under Damien's leadership, word gradually spread among the wider network of families that the Vale organization had weathered its most significant internal crisis in decades, not through further secrecy, but through openness and unflinching resolve. Damien's willingness to acknowledge Elena publicly, to defend her without hesitation, and to confront old enemies directly rather than hiding through careful diplomacy alone, earned him a measure of respect among allies and rivals alike that his father's more cautious approach had never quite achieved. Whatever challenges still lay ahead, whatever careful balance remained necessary in a world built on shifting alliances and old rivalries, Damien and Elena faced it now together, openly, the silence and hidden secrets of the past finally giving way to a future built on truth instead. The hidden drawer that had once concealed a photograph and an unfinished letter now stood empty, its secret fully surfaced, its long silence finally broken, leaving behind only the quiet, steady beginning of everything Damien and Elena chose to build together from that moment forward.